Hello and welcome to The Neutral Voice. I am Samungdev Burma, and in this podcast series, we reflect on how neutrality is practiced in complex, high stakes, and often cross cultural decision making spaces. My guest today is Mr. Thomas P. Valenti, a conflict resolution practitioner whose work spans mediation, arbitration, facilitation, and training across diverse global contexts. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Thomas.
My pleasure.
So, we'll begin with something which would be relatable to most people. Speaking about cross cultural and international work, neutrality is often judged not by intention but by how it is experienced. What feels respectful in one context can feel distant in another. What feels neutral to one party can feel biased to another. In those spaces, neutrality becomes less about position and more about practice, how one listens, how one holds restraint, and how trust is built without shared norms. With that in mind, I'd like to begin by asking, when you hear the phrase neutrality in global practice, what does it mean to you today based on where your work has taken you?
Thank you for that question. It gives me a chance to discuss with you and the audience. First of all, many people interchange neutrality and impartiality. And so instead of getting caught in the nuance, let's consider all of that as the same concept. And I think today, based upon years of experience, neutrality for me is less a position and more like kind of a discipline of being present for the parties with whom I'm working, whether that be in mediation, arbitration, facilitation, or even in the training concept. Maybe earlier in my career, I understood neutrality as kind of maintaining a distance, right? You didn't want anybody to think you're favoring one side or the other. And over time, given work experience and life experience, I see neutrality, especially in the context of cross-cultural work, more as being present with the people, not really trying to convince others that I'm neutral by what I say or my nonverbal cues or other behaviors. And so I think it's important for the audience to realize is we're not neutral because we have a title as a neutral arbitrator or as a neutral mediator. We don't really get to call ourselves neutral. We have to kind of earn that. And we earn it by deciding how we behave in front of the people with whom we work, how we listen to people, how we respond under strains, and whether we're really more committed to understanding people than to achieving a resolution, which might be what we're paid to do or being asked to do in a particular setting. And so for me nowadays, neutrality is more about relationships than it is about positions or declarations that I'm a neutral.
Thank you. So, since we are talking about neutrality in global practice, there comes the differences in culture and background. So, how does cultural context complicate or reshape the idea of neutrality?
It reshapes it almost immediately. I'll approach the question from the standpoint that if we divide the world, many people divide the world, Eastern and Western, and so you know, or the audience should know, I'm a member of the Western tribe, so to speak, right? And so in Western ideas, much of neutrality is based upon some quiet assumptions about shared norms, about directness, time, authority, and kind of what respect looks like in those contexts. Those assumptions don't really travel well from west to east. And so I've learned over time that the same behavior can be read in opposite ways. For example, in some cultures, silence can signal respect.
Mhm.
In others, it can be read as disengagement. Eye contact can signal attentiveness in some cultures, or in others, it can be read as overly aggressive. So neutrality can't be a static concept that we work with. It has to be responsive to the people with whom we work at that point in time. I try to be careful about assuming that my default so-called professional neutral posture will be received as neutral. I have to check myself, right? I have to adjust how I show up so that the professional posture just isn't performative, but rather it's real based upon the credibility I've gained in the role I'm playing at that moment.
Thank you. So now, in your answer, you've touched on the part about listening. So you've spoken before about listening as a discipline rather than a skill. Uh, what do you mean by that?
To me, and others may disagree, but a skill is something you or I may apply.
Mhm.
A discipline is something you practice, that you need to practice, and maybe with restraint, especially our internal systems, how we interpret things. And so if I'm using listening as a discipline, it's always a matter of managing my own impulses. Perhaps in some settings, I have an urge to clarify too quickly, maybe to organize meaning before it's fully expressed by a party or a participant, or maybe to push for a very neat or clean storyline in a conflict because I may be uncomfortable with some ambiguity that exists at that point in time. And so in the cross-cultural settings, we have to be patient. We have to really appreciate that meaning arrives slowly sometimes, and maybe not by a direct line, but rather indirectly, sometimes circular, sometimes a winding road. And I think my personal observation about this is that credibility as a neutral often grows when people sense that I'm not rushing them towards my interpretation of what I think I heard. And sometimes that translates into me being willing to be uncertain or sit with my uncertainty long enough for them or their meaning to come into our room on its own terms, at its own pace, and its own time.
Okay. So, speaking about cultural, political, or moral values, when these three things are in tension, how do you remain neutral?
At the outset, I'll say that in cross-cultural work, cultural, political, or moral values are assumed always in tension, right? And so I don't think neutrality requires silence. It often requires some kind of restraint, uh, especially when those issues collide in some way between the parties with whom we work. For example, you or others may know that for some years I work with primarily female Afghan students, and this is part of my discipline, right? Is how do I learn to be more neutral or work better in cultural environments. So for me, it's almost like an incubator of what I think my discipline is, and that means practicing and practicing and practicing. And lucky for me, I get to do this several times a week with a wonderful, wonderful group of people from a very different culture than mine. And so in that context, if, for example, if I'm having a discussion with using them as the example with these Afghan students, and we talk about what does a good life look like for you as a young woman in Afghanistan, the answer can quite, or the conversation might be split into two very different moral frameworks. Some students may say for them, education and independence is the highest good for them. Others may emphasize family security or reputation as the highest good in their context, not because they rejected education, but because in their lived environment, safety and survival were inseparable from social standing. And so I think the tension isn't about who's right. The tension is that really in both frameworks, and often these are quite young people and quite brilliant about how they can articulate, the tension is both frameworks are anchored in dignity. They just prioritize different risks. One student may example fear that a life is made small without education. Another may fear that life is made unsafe if they attempt education in an environment that's not encouraging that from them. And so neutrality meant not praising one framework as forward thinking or progressive and the other as traditional, but instead of underlying the fears, maybe naming the underlying fears with equal respect. And it allowed the students, maybe through my facilitation, to hear each other without feeling judged by me or, for example, feeling judged by each other. In another context, maybe from not that discipline part of my work, but in a more neutral practice setting, I've seen conflicts in mediation or arbitration grow up around competing definitions of a simple word, fairness. For some participants, fairness may mean equal treatment. For others, it may mean that fairness is acknowledging what's already unequal. If I, as a neutral, or you or anyone else echoes either idea too warmly, if we embrace it too strongly, it can feel like we're taking sides. So in those moments, neutrality has meant keeping both definitions in my view without maybe translating or transforming one into the other, or trying to meld them together into some common idea, but keeping them distinct so that the parties can recognize that they're not only arguing about outcomes, they're really arguing about moral vocabulary. We're not really choosing one side or the other. So in value tension, I don't really decide that I'm trying to reconcile values. For me, it's more important to protect the process, where values can be expressed without humiliation, where individual dignity remains in the room and intact, and where the conversation between those parties that I'm engaged with doesn't collapse into some kind of moral record keeping or score keeping.
Wow. I believe the context that you have laid down really widens the perspectives. Your work involves cross-cultural and international work. So, having already mentioned about the tension that already exists, how is trust built when formal authority or shared norms are weak?
We all claim authority because we're asked by the parties, or maybe some other tribunal authority. We're given that authority. And maybe we're given that based upon our expertise or our experience. But I think for us, the learning point for most of us is that we don't build trust only through expertise or recognition. We build our trust through consistency. Parties watch what we do and what we say we're going to do. They watch whether our reactions, both verbal and nonverbal, are predictable. And very importantly, they react and watch to how we behave when things are uncomfortable or that tension presents, right? And so transparency about limits, what I can do and what I can't do, often builds more trust than confidence ever could, based upon my mere appointment as the neutral in that case. Mm-hmm. Trust comes not because I control the space, but because of my reliability, right? Because of how I behave in the space I control, not because I declare that I'm an authority.
Mm-hmm. So, in relation to that, have you, in your years of experience, have you experienced moments where your neutrality was tested or questioned? And to add on to that, what did you learn from that?
That's a great question, because I think, and we don't always think of our neutrality is being questioned in a direct way. For example, I can recall an occasion where a participant in a conversation shared a view that I could observe was maybe painful or hurtful to others present in the room. And eyes look at me, eyes will look at the neutral for some kind of correction, almost asking without saying, aren't you going to say something? Many people in that context might say, you need to make some response in some kind of voice, some authoritative voice, whether it's a teacher voice, an arbitrator voice, a mediator voice. And that would have shifted the response to me as opposed to them. And so at that moment, we don't want to shift into the moral authority for the room. What do we do? Instead, what I chose to do at that point is maybe slow things down a bit, make space or make room for the impact of that statement to be heard, for people to think about a response so their response is thoughtful, not reactive. And so you say something like this, and I can't remember exactly what I said, but my intention was something along the lines of, I'd like to pause for a moment, because I'm noticing that maybe so-and-so's words were hurtful or landed pretty strongly. Before anyone responds, let's talk about what we heard. Name what we heard, and maybe identify how it affected us. And so that learning for me was that sometimes neutrality is tested precisely when people want you to rescue the room, be the savior. But if you rescue too quickly, or maybe too instinctively, you take away from the participants the opportunity of what maybe in modern parlance they would call agency. You take away from the participants the ability to take ownership over the response in that moment in the room. Let them have agency about what happened. I don't want to lose credibility with the person who feels exposed. I don't want to lose credibility with the person who maybe felt targeted by the words. Mm-hmm. And so the neutral move was not to endorse the statement, not to punish it, but hold the conversation long enough and steady enough for accountability to come from the group, not from me. And if I give the group accountability, the opportunity to be accountable amongst and within themselves, I think I've done a pretty good job as a neutral.
Oh, that's very insightful. So, if there's something about the aspects of your own identity, how does it affect how neutrality is perceived across borders?
It's, for me, I think I start with the premise that neutrality is always filtered through our own identity, right? Whether we want to acknowledge that or not. I don't really get to opt out about how I'm perceived on nationality, profession, appearance, religion, whatever it may be, any part of my background. I don't get to opt out of that. And so what helps us as neutrals is awareness of that rather than denial of that. Mm-hmm. I've said for many years that we work in cross-cultural worlds, and if we're working with parties from one country and another, we don't just have two cultures in the room, we always have the third one as well, and so we have to keep aware of our own identity as we go along. And so sometimes how do we do that is maybe even naming that asymmetry when it's appropriate. We can reduce the power of our own identity by acknowledging it, and maybe when people feel you're conscious of how you're being read or perceived, neutrality becomes more believable. And so I think more than being worried about that kind of neutrality, let's keep in mind that ethical neutrality should be anchored in managing perceptions of us by others honestly, and not pretending that those parties or participants don't have some perception of us that's based upon our own identity.
There's one question lingering on my mind. I just wanted to ask you, since we are talking about neutrality, how much of neutrality do you think can be trained, or is it inherent?
I think we have to train about it, because if we train about it, it becomes aware, right? People need to have an awareness of neutrality throughout, and sometimes it's very difficult. And so I think we can train about it, but you need to have the discipline to make it part of everything you're doing in the context. And it's more important in certain settings than others with certain people. It depends upon the complexity of the people, even their trust of each other, right? Reflects upon the neutrality of the neutral. If they don't trust the court system, the arbitration system, whatever it is, they're not going to trust us. We have to really earn it. And so I think keeping trainees, whether they're young lawyers, law students, whatever they be, aware of it is why it's worth training about. We can't produce the result. We can only produce the awareness of it and the consciousness of it, right? Yeah.
Thank you for this answer. So before we wrap up the session, if you could leave the listeners with one reflection about neutrality in complex global environments, what would it be?
Good question. I think neutrality in my world today isn't about some perfect balance. It's about believability, right? Reliability, believability, and trustworthiness. People don't trust me or other neutrals because we're flawlessly even-handed. They trust us because we're patient, we're consistent, and we're willing to hold complex ideas or tensions without rushing towards a very neat resolution with a bow and a ribbon on it, right? Neutrality for each one of us is sustained through discipline, care of the process, dignity for those who choose us to ask us for assistance, and to maintain space between people when they need space.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas, for sharing for this very delightful and enlightening conversation. And I believe what we have talked about sheds a great amount of light on what neutrality is about. And it's not just something abstract or in theory, but as you have narrated from your very own experience, it gives us an idea of what lived neutrality is. So really thank you for taking the time and joining us in this podcast. And we like to thank all our listeners. This has been the Neutral Voice.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.